Hello guys, my name is Sihlem Kaka. Welcome to today's lesson. We are still on solve for x, but today we'll be looking at inequalities. Then let's just start with our first sum, which is x squared plus 6x plus 5 being greater than 0. Since we'll be dealing with inequalities, we are still going to use some of the principles we used on our first lesson where we are doing factorization. So, as we did mention that when you factorize, you'll firstly focus on your x squared, you skip the middle term, secondly you focus on your constant, then lastly your focus is to be on the middle term. Then, since you are factorizing, you'll have to open two brackets like we were doing on the first lesson. Then, since we said we are focusing firstly on x squared, then we know that x and x will give us an x squared. Then we go on to focus on our constant, where our constant is a 5. Then we'll have to find the factors of 5, which those will be a 5 times a 1, which will give us a 5. Then, these are our factors. So, going to interpret the sum, we need two numbers that when we multiply, they'll have to give us a 5. When we add them, they'll have to give us a 6. Then the factors of 5 is only 5 and a 1. So, 5 times 1 will give us a 5. 5 plus a 1 will give us a 6. Therefore, these factors, they perfectly suit this sum in particular. Then we go on to look at the sign of the constant, which is a plus. A plus meaning that our brackets will have the same sign, taking that from the product rule, which is a negative times a negative, giving us a positive. Also a positive times a positive will give us a positive. But when we multiply a negative times a positive, we get a negative. So we forever treat the sign of our constant as though it's a sign that we got from multiplying either the same sign, which is a negative and a negative, or we're multiplying a positive times a positive. So then, if your constant is positive, it means that your brackets will have the same sign. But which sign will that be? It will be the sign of the middle term. And in this instance, our middle term is having a plus. It's a plus 6. Therefore, the signs in brackets will be positive and a positive. Then from here, we'll have to go on to find our critical values, which are our critical values. I'm using an abbreviation CV for critical values. Then we know that when we factor out this bracket, we'll have a negative 5. Then this one as well will get a negative 1. So these are our critical values, which is a negative 5 and a negative 1. Then after finding your critical values, you'll have to go on to draw a number line. Then on your number line, you must ensure that you'll start with the lesser value on your left, of which between negative 5 and negative 1, the lesser value is a negative 5, then this side will have a negative 1. So, from here, we'll have to look into the signs of the x in brackets, if are they having the same sign. I'm looking at the sign of x, not the signs in bracket. So this x is positive, this x as well is positive, meaning that I'll have to start with a positive because it's what I took from the product rule. When I multiply a positive and a positive, I get a positive. Therefore, the first sign I write here, it's a positive. Why? Because my x, both these x in brackets are having the same sign. So I found my first sign, which is a positive. Because of that, then the sign I write here is the opposite of the sign I wrote, which is the opposite of a positive will be a negative. Then the opposite of a negative will be a positive. Then from here, we'll go on to look at our inequality, which our inequality in this instance, it's saying x squared plus 6x plus 5 is greater than 0. You must remember that when you say something is greater than 0, you are actually saying it's positive. When you are saying it's less than 0, you'll be saying it's negative. Therefore, this sign is saying greater than 0, meaning that I'm looking for my positive. So, for you to remember where your inequality sign is to point, you'll have to use the, let me just take down this positive. I write it down. Then you check, where is my positive? Where is this positive in reference to negative 5? So that's you saying, is it on the left or right of negative 5? So in this instance, you are seeing that your positive is actually on the left of negative 5. Therefore, you'll point to the left of negative 5, of which your positive is actually your x. Your x is less than a negative 5. Then we go on to focus on we focus on the next positive that we have on our number line. Then you write it down, my positive, check. Where is this positive in reference to negative 1? Is it on the left or right of negative 1? Then when you check, this positive is on your right. So you point to the right of negative 1. My positive is on the right of negative 1, of which your positive is referring to your x being greater than a negative 1. So on your exam, this, you are not to write this. This is only to help you understand on where your inequality is to point. So this is not expected to be seen on your exam. Maybe you can just do this aside, then also you give them the answer. This is what you will get your marks for. Then yeah, that's our first sum. We'll go on to look at the second sum. We are on our second sum now, still on inequalities. We'll go for a negative 3x plus a 2 being less than a negative 2. So, in this instance, we can see that our x is to the power of 1, meaning that we won't have to draw a number line. So we'll just go on to solve for x, meaning that we start with our negative 3x being less than a negative 2. We take this 2 to the other side. It will give us a negative 2. Then now we still go on to say negative 3x is less than a negative 4. Then from here, we are solving for x, so we must make x substitute of the formula. So, meaning that we'll have to remove a negative 3 by dividing with the negative 3. Then what you do on the left, you'll have to do on the right. Negative 3, then a negative 2 will cancel a negative 3. This side will remain with an x being less than a negative divided by a negative, we get a positive, which is now will be a 4 over 3. So that will be our answer, x being less than 4 over 3. Yeah, then we'll go on to look at our next sum, the third sum. With our inequality, we are now on our third sum. We'll look at, for our third sum, we go for x squared plus 7x minus 8 less than 0. Yeah? X squared plus 7x minus 8 being less than 0. Then we go on to focus firstly on x squared. Secondly, it's a constant. Then lastly, it's our middle term. So, since we're on inequalities, we still have to open two brackets because our x is squared. Then we focus firstly on x squared, of which it will be x and x, giving us an x squared. Then we go on to focus on our constant. Our constant is a negative 8. So we need two numbers that when we multiply, they'll give us an 8. When we subtract, they'll give us a 7. So we'll have to look into the factors of 8, which is 8 times 1. It's an 8. Then it's 4 times a 2, giving us an 8. So these are the factors we have for 8. Then we go back to our sum. We need two numbers that when we multiply, they must give us an 8. When we subtract, they must give us a 7. So the first factors, 8 times 1, it's indeed an 8. And 8 minus 1 will get a 7. Therefore, these factors, they best suit the sum in particular, because if you were to use the 4 times 2, you will indeed get an 8, but when you say 4 minus a 2, you'll get a 2, of which this does not go along with the sum we are having. Therefore, these ones, they are disqualified to be used on our sum. So we'll go for our 8 times 1. Then we go on to look at the sign of the constant, which is a negative. Then we go to our product rule, which is a negative times a negative, giving us a positive. We go on to a positive times a positive. We still get a positive. But when we look into a negative times a positive, we get a negative. So now our constant is a negative, meaning that different signs are to be on our brackets. So it's a negative and a positive. That will give us a negative. For I said, we forever treat the sign of the constant as though it's a sign that we got from multiplying two signs. Then we got a product being a negative. So now the question is, how do I place my signs? Because I'll have to put a positive and a negative. Then you go on to use the rule that says the bigger number takes sign of the middle term. So on the factors you used, the bigger number will have to take sign of the middle term. The bigger number is 8. Sign of the middle term is a plus. Therefore, obviously, this side will have to have a negative. Then you go for your critical values. So I just wrote an abbreviation, which is CV for critical values, of which when I factor out this, I'll get a negative 8. Then on this bracket, I'll get a 1. So now, since I have my critical values, I'll have to go to my number line. And remember that on your number line, you forever have to write the lesser number on your left, which is a negative 8, then a 1. For a negative 8 is lesser than a 1. So on your left, you forever start with a lesser number. Then the other one you write on your right. Then after you have written your number line, you go on to focus on the signs of x in brackets. For my x is positive, this x is positive, this x as well is positive. So you look to check if the x's in brackets are having the same sign. If they have the same sign, we are still applying the product rule. If they have the same sign, it means that multiplying the same sign, you get a positive, whether those signs were negative, negative, or it was a positive and a positive. So in this instance, it means it's a positive times a positive, which will give me what? A positive. Then, after you've gotten your first sign, you'll have to just write the opposite of the sign you wrote, which is a positive, and an opposite sign of a positive will be a negative, an opposite sign of a negative, it will have to be a positive. Then, after I've written my signs, I go on to focus on my inequality. My inequality is a less than 0. Whenever you're saying something is less than 0, it means you're saying that thing is negative. So now, I'm looking for a less than 0, which is a negative. I go to my number line. I check, where is my negative? This is a positive, this is a negative. Where is my negative? My negative is between a negative 8 and a 1. My negative is between a negative 8 and a 1. So, I go on to write that thing. My negative being between a negative 8 and a 1. Then, whenever you're writing something that is between, both your signs will have to face your left. So then, this negative is actually referring to your x being between a negative 8 and a 1. So then, this, as I said on the first sum, this is not, you're not supposed to write this on your exam. I use this method only to show you how we arrived at the answer. This is what will reward you with marks. They'll have to mark this. So this you can just do aside for your own sake. Maybe it will make things simpler for you as to know how to place your signs. But this is the answer they are looking for. Yeah, we'll go on our fourth sum. For this one, we are done. We are continuing with our inequalities. We are now on our fourth sum. The fourth sum is x plus a 1. Then we have a 4 minus x being greater than 0. So we are still on inequalities, but this question, it's a bit different from the ones we just dealt with. In this instance, you already have your brackets. That's like they've already found the factors for you, so you just have to continue from here. And please don't waste time by starting by trying to factorize, like factor out this, and you'll have an equation. Then again, you'll have to reopen the brackets. That will take time for you to arrive at your answer, of which you are on an exam and you are timed. So you have to utilize your time correctly. Yeah, so let's go on with it. We have x squared plus 1 in brackets, also 4 minus x close bracket greater than 0. So from here, I can just go on to finding my critical values, of which this side, for the first bracket, x plus 1, I'll have a negative 1. Then, for this bracket, I'll take my 4 to the other side. Then I'll have x being a positive 4. So these are my critical values. But for you to avoid mistakes, you'll have to take these brackets, move aside, equate to 0. Then obviously you have to take your 1 to the other side. It will be a negative 1. Take this other bracket as well. 4 minus x, equate it to 0. Then take your x to the other side, you'll get a 4. Just in case you get confused as to how I arrived at my negative 1 and a 4. So after you have found your critical values, you'll have to go to your number line, of which your number line start with the lesser number, which is my negative 1. Then I'll have my 4. Once you're done, having placed your critical values on your number line, you go on to check your x if they are having the same sign. So in this instance, This x is positive, this x is negative. So, knowing our product rule, which is a negative times a negative, being a positive, and a positive times a positive, being a positive, but when we multiply a negative times a positive, we get a negative. Therefore, this x is positive, this one is negative, meaning that we are here where we are multiplying a negative times a positive, which will give us a negative. So the first sign we'll have to write on our number line will be a negative. Reason being, this x is positive, this one is negative. Multiplying negative and a positive, you get a negative. So the first sign will be a negative. So once you've found the first sign, you'll have to write the opposite of the sign you have found, which here, the first sign is negative. The opposite of a negative, I write my positive. Then the opposite sign of a positive, I write a negative. Then, once we are done placing your signs, you'll then have to go to look at your inequality. Your inequality, it's saying greater than 0. Greater than 0, meaning that you're looking for a positive. So, a greater than 0 is a positive. Then you go to your number line, you check, where is my positive? This is a negative, positive, negative. So I only have one positive. Then you have to check or ask yourself, where is this positive? So this positive is between a -1 and a 4. Here's my positive, being between a -1 and a 4. I just write that my positive is between a -1 and a 4. As I said on the previous sum we dealt with, I said if what you are looking for is between, your signs will have to, they'll both have to point to the left. So my positive is between -1 and 4. Between, your signs, they face your left, both of your signs. But this positive is actually referring to your x, which is your x is between a -1 and a 4. And as I said, still, this is not expected in your exam. We use this only to help you to realize how, or notice how we were to place our signs. So this is not expected. Maybe you can just do it aside with your pencil, but then this is the answer you are expected to give on your exam. Then we are done with this sum. So our answer was x is between -1 and 4. So this sum is done. We'll have to go to our fifth sum. We are still on inequalities. Then we'll look into our next sum. And that sum, it's a -3 x plus 7 x minus 5 being less than 0. Then looking at a sum like this, you'll have to go for the BODMAS rule, which is bracket first. So -3, then you'll have to multiply out, which is x and x, then x to a -5, which is x times x. You'll get an x squared. X times a -5, you get minus 5x. You do the same with your 7 times x, 7 times a -5. 7 times x will give you a plus 7x. A 7 times a -5, you'll get a -35. Then you close your brackets, never forgetting your inequality. From here, you'll have to look into your like terms. So it's your -3 remaining and your x squared. Then a -5x plus a 7x, since they are like terms, a -5 plus 7x will give you a plus 2x. Then with your -35, close your bracket. Then from here you'll have to multiply out with a -3. The -3 times x squared, you get a -3 x squared. -3 times 2x, you'll get a -6x. -3 times negative 35, you get a plus 105 less than 0. Then from here, you'll have to divide with the negative 3 throughout. It's negative 3 x squared minus 6x plus 105 being less than 0. You divide throughout with the negative 3, negative 3, negative 3. So negative 3, you get an x squared, since they'll cancel out. Then a negative 6 divided by negative 3, you'll get a plus 2x. 105 divided by negative 3, you'll get a negative 35. Never forgetting that since you were removing this negative from x squared, your sign will have to change from facing being less than 0 to a greater than 0. So from here, you'll then have to factorize, opening two brackets. So have you forgotten that your sign is to change? It will then make your sum to be incorrect. Remember that always when we are changing the sign of the x squared, whether you're multiplying out or you are dividing throughout with a negative, your sign will have to change. Since this one was a less than, it will then be a greater than. So from here then, we'll then have to factorize, where we open our two brackets, being greater than 0. Then we focus on our x squared, which is now x, and x will give us an x squared. Then we go on to focus on our constant, which is negative 35, of which here you'll multiply a 7 times a 5. Then this is our sign of the constant, which is a negative, of which we'll then look into our product rule, which is a negative times a negative, we get a positive. We go on to look at a positive times a positive, we get a positive. As much as we look into a negative times a positive, we get a negative. So in this instance, our constant is a negative, meaning that we multiplied signs, two different signs in brackets to get a negative. As we treat the sign of our constant as though it's a product sign, so then in this instance it's a negative, it means my signs will have to be different in bracket. Then how do you place your signs? You then use the rule that says the bigger number, referring to your factors, will have to take the sign of the middle term. So all my factors, I use 7 and 5, the bigger number is 7. It must take sign of the middle term, which should be a plus. Then obviously this one will take a negative. Then you go on to do your critical values, which I'm using CV as my abbreviation for critical values. From there on, I know that on this bracket, my x will be a negative 7. For this one, my x will be a 5. So after writing your critical values, you'll have to go to your number line. Then your number line, you'll place your critical values, which is a negative 7, also a 5. Then from here, you'll then have to put the signs here, of which this x in bracket will help you into finding the signs to place here. Then check if your x in brackets are having the same sign. So this x is positive, this x is also positive, which takes us back to our product rule. So multiplying things of the same sign, if I ever get a positive, whether both my x were negative, I still have a positive. In this instance, they are positive. Positive and positive is still a positive. So the first sign I start with here, it's a positive. Then the opposite of this positive will be a negative. Opposite of this negative will be a positive. Then from here, after writing this sign, my signs, I'll then have to go back to my inequality. Now my inequality is greater than 0, meaning that positive. Everything that is greater than 0, you are referring to something that is positive. Everything that is less than 0, you are referring to something that is negative. So in this instance, my equation is greater than 0. So I'm looking for a positive. Then I go on to check on my number line. My positive, this positive, where is it? In reference to -7. So you check your positive, is it on the left or right of -7? So this positive, it's on the left. I point to the left. Left of what? -7. Of which this positive is actually referring to your x being less than -7. Or then I go on to focus on this positive. I write it down. This positive, where is it in reference to 5? Is it on the left or right of 5? Then you see this positive is on the right. So you point to the right. Right of what? Of 5. Of which this positive is referring to your x being greater than 5. Then x is less than 7 or x is greater than 5. But then, as I did mention, this is not to show on your exam. We only use this to help you know where is your inequality supposed to point. So in this instance, it had to point to the left, meaning that your x was less than -7. This one, your x greater than 5. But this you can just do aside when you do your calculations. But then, when you submit your script, you'll have to, this is what you have to submit, not this. Then yeah, that's it. So we'll see each other. We are still on inequalities. So we'll just go on to solve the next sum. That sum will be 2x minus 3 to the 2, then less or equals to 169. Then for such a sum, remember there's a 2, meaning that you're going to have the same bracket twice, which is 2x minus 3, still less or equals to 169. Then from here, we'll use the Bodmer's rule, bracket first. We have to multiply out this bracket. Then we use our FOIL method, which will multiply 2x times 2. Then we multiply 2x times a -3. So a 2x times a 2x, you'll get a 4x squared. Then we go for a 2x times a -3. We get a -6x. Then we go on to do the same with the -3, which will be our -3 times 2x, -3 still times a -3. And a -3 times 2x, you'll get a -6x. Then you multiply -3 times a -3, you get a +9, being less or equals to 169. Then from here, we are seeing the like terms, so we go for 4x squared, -6x minus 6x, we get a -12x. Then with our +9, less or equals to 169. Then now we'll have to take that 169 to our equation, which is then minus 12x still. I'm taking this thing as it is, +9. I take my 169 to the other side. The sign will have to change. We'll have a minus 169. Then now we'll be left with a 0. So these two are like terms. So I have my 4x squared minus 12x. This one will give us a -160, being less or equals to 0. Then from here, we'll have to divide with a 4 throughout. meaning that our my 4x squared minus 12x minus 160 less or equals to 0. Then we now divide by 4, divide by 4, we get an x squared. From here, this is 4, 8, 12, we'll get a negative 3x. This is how many 4s are in 160, we get a negative 40 being less or equals to a 0. Then from here, we'll have to factorize this, where we open two brackets. Then we get an x and an x, which focusing on x squared, you'll get x and x to give you an x squared. Then you go on to focus on your constant. Then you need the factors of 40 that when you multiply, they'll give you a 40. When you subtract, they give you a 3. Then you go for an 8 times 5, giving you a 40. And you also have a 10 times 4, giving you a 40. You'll still have a 20 times 2. So you have many factors that will give you a 40. But in this instance, I'm looking for two numbers that when I multiply, they'll have to give me a 40. But when I subtract, it'll have to give me a 3. So the first option for which is for 8 times 5 is a 40. Then 8 subtracting a 5 will get a 3. So these, they best suit the sum, this sum I'm having. These one disqualify, so I'll have to use my 8 and a 5. So from here, I'll go on to focus on the sign I have for my constant, which is a negative, using the product rule, which is a negative times a negative, you get a positive, still a positive, times a positive, you get a positive. But as you multiply a negative times a positive, you get a negative. So now my constant is having a negative. This negative meaning that we're multiplying things of different signs. So it means that my bracket must have different signs. Then how do I place my signs? I'll then use the rule that says the bigger number must take sign of the middle term. So between 8 and 5, the bigger number is 8. And the sign of the middle term is a negative. So the bigger number takes sign of the middle term. My middle term is having a negative, so 8 will have to take the negative. Then obviously 5 will be a positive 5. Then from here, you go on to find your critical values. As I use the abbreviation CV for critical values, then with this bracket, I'll get a negative 5. And then this one, I'll get an 8. So now that I have my critical values, I go to my number line. My number line, write my negative 5, then my 8. From here, I'll have to write the signs, of which I'll take that from the x in bracket. Check, are the x's having the same sign? In this instance, yes, this x is positive, this x is positive as well. So going back to the product rule, a positive times a positive is a positive. So the first sign I'll write is a positive. Then the opposite of a positive will be a negative. Opposite of a negative is a positive. So from here, I'll then go on to check my inequality. My inequality is saying less or equals to a 0. So less than 0, meaning that it's negative. So you go to your number line, a negative, your negative is between a minus 5 and an 8. Then I said for your between sign, you'll forever write your sign, they must face your left. Both of your signs must face your left, of which your negative is actually referring to your x, the x you're looking for. So your x is between negative 5 and 8. As I did mention that this, you are not to write this on your exam. It was only to help you point out as to where my negative is. So this you are not to write. You can just write it aside for it to assist you in writing the correct inequality sign, but then the sign is less or equals to 0, so then you'll have to put those there. So your x is between a -5 and an 8. Then that's your answer for this sum. Yeah, we're done.